Good afternoon, colleagues and friends. It's wonderful to have all of you. I see a good number online. Thank you for joining us. And I want to thank you, Masiiwa, for agreeing to do this with us today. I met Masiiwa in person after reading some of his works, but in person, I met Masiiwa for the first time in 2016 in October in Lusaka, Zambia, when we both attended a consultation organized by the All Africa Theological Association by extension, by Reverend Dr. Mabuluki. So I met him there for the very first time, and we've been in touch since. And I want to thank you for agreeing to be with us today. And I'm just going to share just a brief bio of who Masiiwa is. So Masiiwa Regis Gunda, I was going to ask you, what does Masiiwa mean? But never mind. But Masiiwa Gunda is currently the program executive on overcoming racism, xenophobia, and related discrimination at the World Council of Churches. That's in Geneva, Switzerland. He serves as Adjunct Professor at the Ecumenical Institute, Bossey, still in Switzerland. Masiiwa holds a PhD in Intercultural Applied Biblical Studies from the University of, I don't know how to pronounce that, Bayreuth or Bayreuth, Germany. His honors and master's degrees were attained from the University of Zimbabwe. So today we are looking forward to hearing what you are going to share with us. And the topic is, the title of what Masiiwa is going to talk to us about is the decolonial and anti-racism potential of the food divinity of Jesus Christ, the Nicene Creed then and now. Thank you, Masiiwa. Inspire us.
Thank you so much. I almost thought you were talking about somebody else because I'm not as big as you tried to make me. But thank you. I'm very grateful and humbled. And thank you so much for inviting me. This is not something that I take for granted, that you get this kind of opportunity. But I also must put some disclaimers on the way, lest I raise too many expectations. I'm neither a missiologist nor properly an expert on the Nicene Creed. I am rather more of a disruptive element in most of the things that I do. So what I share with you are reflections that I've been having, particularly since the realization that 2025 was going to be filled up with symbolically important anniversaries within the ecumenical movement. And one of these milestones is obviously the 1700 years since Nicaea 325, but also the 140th anniversary since the partitioning of Africa by European powers in 1884, 1885. I mentioned this particularly because my work with the WCC has been working towards an ecumenical commemoration of this anniversary because of its implications on the evangelization of Africa and so on, but also 100 years after the Life and Work anniversary or after the Life and Work conference in Stockholm in 1925. So 2025 is an important ecumenical year within the life and work of the WCC. And so because of that, I was drawn into reflecting more and more about Nicaea, which in a way brings a whole lot of Christian expressions into some kind of unity. And so I don't speak as properly a Nicene expert. I don't speak as properly a mission expert, but I do speak as somebody who is passionate about the questions of decolonization, the questions of anti-racism or justice in general. So when we met first time with Mutale, it was within the context of our commitments towards justice. And so that has been our journey. So allow me to share my screen so I can try to walk through the kinds of reflections that I have been having these past few years, particularly from last year. I have intentionally been focusing a lot more on Nicaea and what Nicaea means to us as Christians today. So I try to look. In November last year, I was speaking at a conference where I was looking at the decolonial and anti-racism potentials of the gathering at Nicaea in terms of who was present and in terms of the outcomes in general. But today I opted to focus particularly on what this idea of the full divinity of Christ could mean for our quest to decolonize, but also our quest to overcome racism or to achieve racial justice. And I speak in a context, so let me, okay. So this should work well for me now. Okay, so now you can see the slides. So I'll speak. We are speaking at a time when inequalities are widening in the world today and deepening. Whether we want to speak of the North, South, but most of us now also realize that the North-South divide is occurring even within nations, within countries. This is not simply about the equator dividing the planet into the south, into the north, but rather our living conditions and the inequalities that we are experiencing, dividing even our own countries into some ideological north-south binaries. And so this is a reality that we are witnessing. And in a way, it does explain a whole lot more other challenges that we are currently witnessing in the world. But that is a story for another day. The legacies of enslavement and colonization are in many ways than one determinative of the outcomes in the areas of wealth, health, and education for racialized and colonized or formerly colonized people. So these are realities of our time. The contestation between the forces of the common good and those of private privilege, of colonial domination and decolonial disruption have manifested in all generations. In other words, what we are experiencing is not something new. What we are experiencing is a continuation of this historic context that I think we can also see within the context of the Nicene, the first Council of Nicaea, but also the subsequent councils that followed Nicaea and continued to add to the Nicene Creed. And finally, as I introduce this today, we seek to explore the oft unspoken or unseen disruptive elements of the Nicene Creed, the creed that brings many strands of Christianity into some kind of unity. I know, being with the World Council of Churches, I know that we are still struggling to achieve the kind of unity that we desire or that we hope is possible, but there is some level of unity that does exist. And one of those points that unify Christians is the significance of the Nicene Creed, even though there are some that obviously stand outside of this. Now, what are my assumptions? I have three assumptions that are guiding what I'm sharing with you this afternoon, or maybe this morning for others and this evening for others even. I'm not too sure from where we are joining this talk today. So the first assumption is that there were colonial and colonizing forces at play during the time of the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea in 325 CE and the subsequent councils that occurred thereafter. And I know that sometimes within academic circles, it is very easy to be accused of anachronism, especially because the concepts or the words colonial, colonization, colonialism, and so on, these are recent terms. But what they stand for, which is the desire to dominate and to economically exploit others, are ideas that have always characterized the empires and kingdoms in the ancient world. So I'm using these terms rather much more flexibly within that context of the quest for domination and exploitation of the other. So from that perspective, I am working from that assumption that when we look closely at the environment around 325, then we can identify some colonial and colonizing forces. The second assumption is that there were forces of resistance during these ecumenical councils, even though they came from a position of weakness, having been maimed, persecuted, even almost killed by the colonial forces. And I'm speaking here fully aware of the fact that when the Council of Nicaea gathers in 325, barely 2 decades earlier, maybe less than 2 decades earlier, these bishops that are gathering at Nicaea had been going through severe persecution. And history suggests that most of them might have been bishops with disabilities because of the consequences of the persecution that the church had suffered. And so these are people that are coming into the lion's den. Yet they are coming with a clear intention to continue to uphold the essence of the faith that had led to them being persecuted. These were forces of resistance. And the third and final assumption that I bring, or that is guiding my talk, is that both the colonizing and decolonial, the resistance forces, sought and partly succeeded in embedding colonizing and or disruptive or decolonizing ideas into the critical outcome of these councils, that is the Nicene Creed. So these are the three main assumptions that I'm working with as I share with you this afternoon. So on the nature of Jesus Christ, because we know experts say the critical or foundational reason for the Nicene Council was to decide on the relationship between God the Father and God the Son, which in a way might have also been a quest to decide on the nature of Jesus Christ. And the Nicene Creed, in 2 paragraphs, gives attention to this question of who Jesus Christ is. And so I put these 2 paragraphs on our slide here. The first one, which really looks at, so we believe, this is what we believe. And in November, I was speaking about the effect of saying we believe and not that we know. Because in a way, in some instances, we believe the things that we cannot rationally decide on, or that we cannot rationally understand or know. And so we believe. And so we believe in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. Through him all things. But in this very first sentence in this paragraph, there is no doubt that the Council of Nicaea, and there have been revisions and adjustments through until the Council of Chalcedon. What is clear from this sentence is the understanding of Jesus Christ as fully divine. This is not a semi-divine being that is partly divine, maybe partly human, but this is a fully divine human being. And this, for me, does present us with opportunities for the work that I'm currently doing within the WCC, because I have realized since joining the WCC that there is a lot of value and strength in identifying points of learnings from our history. That it is much easier for Christians to accept things if we can indicate and demonstrate that what we are not doing is not innovation, what we are doing is recovering. We are recovering what is already present within our history. And I believe that in portraying, in understanding Jesus Christ as fully divine, one and the same with the Father, the bishops at Nicaea have played a fast one on the empire, even under the empire's own nose. And I will articulate a bit more on this point as we proceed. And so the Nicene Creed goes on to also, in a way, embrace the humanity of Jesus by then acknowledging the role of the Virgin Mary in the incarnation of Jesus, of God becoming man. In a way, again, what the fathers, what the bishops at Nicaea have done is to continue to insert, to infuse disruptive elements that would not necessarily serve the empire as the emperor would have wanted. Because the emperor's involvement is not for the Christian sake. The emperor's involvement is because of what is at stake for the empire and for the kingdom. And so I look at these two and think there are elements in these that could provide us with a basis to do a purely and thoroughly Christian decolonial work using the Nicene Creed, or Christian anti-racism work using, once again, the Nicene Creed. And I read also Gerald West, one scholar that has inspired me over the years. And he has written something about the Nicene Creed. And then he finds some, I would say, a valid critique that what the bishops at the First Council of Nicaea in particular missed was dedicating time to the horizontal human social dimensions of the life, ministry, and mission of Jesus. Even though I think, yes, there is to a certain extent something that can point us towards that, but that those elements were clearly not fully addressed within this context, because the question at hand that motivated the council was not a question regarding the social dimensions of Jesus' life and ministry. Rather, it was questions around the divine dimension or the religious dimension of Jesus' life and ministry. And so the Council of Nicaea tended to emphasize this particular dimension of Jesus' life at the expense of the horizontal, which is also very critical, especially when we are thinking in a decolonial and anti-racist way. And so, without rejecting the humanity of Jesus, so on the third day, we see all these things again building up to the divinity of Christ. But without rejecting the humanity of Jesus, because it doesn't. The creed itself does not say Jesus was not human, even though it could have said more about the humanity of Jesus, but it does not reject the humanity of Jesus. This creed upholds the full, not partial divinity of Jesus Christ in a way that challenges and disrupts existing conventions, particularly of kings and of leaders within the time, within the ancient Near East during this particular time. And so when we look at the ancient Near Eastern conventions on power and divinity, a purely secular view of Near Eastern kingship does not take into account the special relationship that existed between the king and the gods or the god, and therefore we can never fully appreciate the church-state relations of the ancient world if we try to apply particularly a European perspective in which church and state have to be looked at as separate entities, one secular and another religious. And this could be said also for many African kingdoms. I come from a background where our peoples never knew that there was something called politics that existed independently of something called religion, because life was always understood in a holistic and total kind of way that brought everything together into different phases or different aspects of the one life that could be lived in a community. And the title I had, in whom all these dimensions of life were united, was always the chief or the king, in whom you could say he was the political leader, but then he also presided over communal rituals, which made him also a religious leader to a certain extent. And he was responsible for the economic affairs of the kingdom, meaning he also was the chief entrepreneur, or however you want to call the chief economic player in a given community. So the idea of a separation of powers between religion and politics is not one that we can apply in the ancient Near East of this time. The first Mesopotamian ruler who declared himself divine was Naram-Sin of Akkad. And so we already have precedents where emperors and kings could claim some level of divinity and humanity combined. And this already in the 23rd century before the Common Era, we already have instances in Mesopotamia where a king declares themselves to be divine and even presented themselves as the husband of the warrior goddess Ishtar. Now you can imagine what this does to power relations within the kingdom. If somebody that is in authority is also the husband of the goddess of the land, then they have almost absolute power over other people. they are not ordinary human beings. They are qualitatively different from the rest. And this is an idea that is already in circulation within the ancient Near East. When you look at Egypt, and these were really some of the major powers of the ancient Near East, the fundamental concept of Egyptian kingship was that the king or pharaoh was a superhuman being, a kind of a god from birth. And they were also believed to have been begotten by the sun god and the first king Ra, Amon-Re maybe. And therefore, metaphysically, the Egyptian pharaohs were supposedly divine and belonging in the class of the gods, even though not fully gods, but they belonged within this general class of gods. When we then look at Israel, from which the Jesus movement emerges, kingship in Israel was rather integrated into a theocratic system. And I think most of us here will be aware that kingship in Israel emerged as a contested innovation within the political systems of Israel because of this desire and belief in the relevance and appropriateness of a theocratic system in which only Yahweh alone was considered king and absolute ruler of the universe. And so the human king emerges, but the human king is not divine in his own right. And the human king only does receive once kingship is embraced in Israel. The divine king is beloved, is favored by the God of Israel. But he is never divine himself, even though there are tendencies where sometimes there are elements of being superhuman. If you are reading the narratives of David, the narratives of Solomon, the elements of the king being superhuman or more than just a normal human being are quite present within the biblical narratives. And so while the Mesopotamian king is said to be adopted or nursed and reared by the gods, and that he is holy by virtue of his familiarity with the gods, they are believed to partake in the eternity, in the splendor and the glory of the gods. So there is a level at which the Mesopotamian gods, the Egyptian pharaohs, are quite a step higher than ordinary human beings. They are not truly human like all of us. They have been favored to a higher level of being human. And so there is a qualitative difference between the Egyptian pharaohs and the Mesopotamian kings. So while there were different expressions of the divinity of kings in the ancient Near East, it is apparent that whether it was as semi-gods, superhuman, or mortal vice regents, the rulers appropriated immense power from this association with the divine. The rulers appropriated immense power. And this is not something that we can only see in the ancient world. In fact, there are many instances where modern, contemporary rulers have tried to appropriate for themselves some level of divinity in order to justify absolute power within their countries. So we have had instances where leaders have, I think, encouraged supporters to present and hail them as divinely ordained or chosen, and even legendary narratives have been created to show that leaders had an unusual or extraordinary childhood. That in a way, now that we look back, we see that God had chosen them even when they were still children and destined them to be rulers in their countries and for their people. So this association with the divinity is something that leaders have always desired. Leaders have always desired because of the benefits of getting the benefit of the doubt from people that are so fearful or faithful to the divinities. So if a leader claims to be divinely ordained, then there is a whole lot more power associated with that. And this association with the divine led to the class of the rulers on the one hand, and the class of the ruled or the working people. And this is critical for the understanding of the emergence of racism, particularly in the modern times. The division of communities into the class of rulers and the class of the ruled or the class of the working people is very critical, because at some point, the class of the working people has to be divided in order to maintain the unchallenged position of the class of the rulers. And racism becomes one of those effective ways in which the ruled or the working people could be divided so that they could not believe in the existence of a common enemy, a common exploiter within their context. And the second is that this association with the divine led to the Nicene Creed through its articulation of the divinity of Jesus Christ. It then disrupts and unsettles this obtaining convention that divided society into a class of privileges and a class of workers. The Nicene Creed, by insisting, sorry, is that a comment? Okay, thank you. So the Nicene Creed, and this is part of my thesis, the Nicene Creed, by insisting in a context where rulers are seeking to be divine, but not being fully divine because they know they are not fully divine. And so what we are seeing is a creation of some level of divinity, of some level of being superhuman. And in this context, the Nicene bishops come up with a construction that creates one fully divine being that has walked the earth. And this, for me, leads to giving the Nicene Creed the potential to disrupt the conventions of the ancient Near East on the association between power and divinity. That the class of privileges and the class of workers are all subject to this one divine, fully divine being, and not any other kind of divinity is to be compared with this particular divine being. And so I will briefly speak to classism and racism. And this, again, is something that I have been reflecting on, again, as we continue to try and imagine how we can continued to make gains in the work on overcoming racism. And in contemporary times, capitalism has successfully created the class of rulers, the profiteers or profit takers, mostly about 1% of the global population, and a class of workers, those whose collective contributions make the profits for the 1% to harvest. And what this means, once you look at these statistics, it already begins to show that those of us that are racially divided by these contemporary systems are actually closer together in that we are being exploited by the same system. And yet, the same system has created enough smokescreen for us to find other reasons to be divided. In order to avoid the 99% from rising up against the 1%, the profit-taking rulers introduced concepts such as meritocracy, individualism, and representative democracy. Concepts that divide the 99% into fighting amongst themselves by allowing some small trinkets of privileges to reach some among the class of workers. So this is a system that's not completely modern. This is a system that has always been happening because those that grab all the profits, the bulk of the profits, know that if the laborers started working together, then the profit takers would have no chance. Their only chance lies in having the laborers fighting amongst themselves. Classism divides poor whites of our time from identifying with poor blacks, poor browns, poor yellows, poor whatever color we might want to think of. So instead of us coming together as people that are being exploited by the profiteers, we are busy trying to outdo each other in our level of exploitation and poverty. And therefore, in our internal strives within the class of the workers, we provide the safety nets for the profit takers. So classism and racism are concepts that I think we're beginning to try and focus more and more on. And what I like about it is also the potential of the Nicene Creed to give us purely Christian resources to begin to problematize and interrogate contemporary expressions of classism and racism. As I said at a conference in November last year, the only qualification for a bishop to attend the Nicene Council was the office that they held, which is that they were bishops. Their ethnicity does not arise as a topic for discussion. But we all know that this was a challenge, a question that had emerged in North Africa. And North Africa, historically at this period, is still occupied by significant populations of Black Africans. The only bishops that were disqualified from the Nicene Council were the Jewish bishops, for the obvious reasons that the emperor was creating a kind of an anti-Semitic movement against Jews, because they were also using these elements to try and create a kind of unity among Christians by creating a common enemy for the different fighting Christian factions. But ethnicity, from which racism emerges, does not arise as a question of interest when it comes to convening and deciding which bishops will be available to attend the Nicene Creed. And the proclamation on the full divinity of Christ, it does not exclude any other people from being answerable to this one fully divine being that Jesus Christ was. So what are the decolonial aspects as we try to drive towards the end of this talk? The decolonial aspects of the creedal belief. By insisting on one Lord, the creed disrupts the colonizing belief in the many lordships that existed in the ancient Near Eastern political thought and practice. The kings had no mandate to represent God or people. They were rulers loyal only to their private privilege and interest. In having only one Lord, it is no longer obligatory, or at least we can begin to argue that as Christians, we are not obliged to simply follow any king or any kingdom because there is only one Lord. There has to be other bases to follow kings and kingdoms, but not simply because they are kings or they are kingdoms, because there is only one Lord. And there is only one mediator between God and humanity, or better still, between God and creation. And that is the only being that is fully divine, that is Jesus Christ. No other earthly king or ruler can claim a position of superiority just first among equals. In dying for us, Jesus disrupts the classicist convention of people dying for their kings. And this is the tradition. In many cases, and I watch quite a lot of movies, some of them warlike and so on. And in most movies that have presidential characters in them, I have watched young men, young women sacrificing themselves for the life of the president, for the life of the king. In Jesus, this convention is disrupted and subverted. Instead of followers of Jesus dying to protect their king, their Lord, instead what we have is the Lord dying for their people. This is disruptive. This is not the convention of how we understand leadership, the way ancient leaders, even contemporary modern leaders, would present their understanding of being the leader. People have to die for the leaders, not the leader dying for the people. And so in Jesus Christ, we have an intentional subversion of these human conventions on power and divinity. By upholding the divinity, the full divinity of Jesus Christ, the creed disrupted the convention of semi-divinities and superhumans standing between God or gods and ordinary people. The people's loyalty to kings had to be based on something other than the king's claims to divinity. If we are going to be loyal to any kingdom, to any king, it has to be for something other than the fear that they are closer to the gods than all of us. Because in Jesus Christ, in the way that the creed constructs God and human beings, we all are equalized in the full divinity of Jesus. There is no basis for human claims to superiority over creation, for example, because everything was created by God and was created through this single mediatory being that is Jesus Christ, the fully divine being. We all owe our existence to the divine work of God, nothing owes its existence to any human being. Neither creation, whether the ones in water, on land, or in the air, or their existence to human beings. Whether it is the ruling, profit-taking, or the ruled and working classes. None of us is responsible for creation because we are part of creation. Only Jesus Christ, through his being fully divine, which makes Jesus Christ eternal, is the only one responsible for creation, because creation is created through him and he is fully divine, therefore the one responsible. And so the idea that human kings can be superior and above all other beings, whether human or the general creation, is something that cannot be sustained if we choose to apply a decolonial and racial justice lens to the Nicene Creed. It does not provide space or room for the superiority of some human beings. The Council of Nicaea, with bishops coming from Africa, Asia, and Europe, did not suffer from racial prejudice. And the Creed leaves no room for racial prejudice. In the practice of the faith, there is one Jesus Christ for all people. There is no room for separation, neither does it present human beings in a kind of categorized framework in which some are nearer to Jesus than others. The only kingdom, according to the Nicene Creed, that will not experience a decline is that of Jesus Christ. No matter how powerful a kingdom might appear today, if it is not Jesus' kingdom, it will surely crumble to an end. And this is in the presence of Constantine in 325, that maimed, injured bishops are inserting in the most important outcome of the council almost a condemnation of the Constantinian Empire. It will surely come to an end because it is not Jesus' kingdom. So in a way, again, within this contestation between the colonial and colonizing forces and the decolonial disruptive forces, these maimed bishops succeed in setting in the context of these conversations very disruptive elements that did not leave Constantine in a better position than he was before the council. And in fact, historians say after the Council of Nicaea of 325, Constantine realized that the outcomes of Nicaea were not as favorable as he would have wanted, and that he went on to re-persecute the Nicene Fathers and tried to reconcile with the Arian Fathers. So it is clear that at some point, Constantine realized that he had been outsmarted and undermined. Decolonial Nicaea concluding observations and propositions. So Gerald West bemoans the fact that the Council of Nicaea did not pay adequate attention to the humanity of Jesus' person as well as Jesus' earthly ministry. A focus on that further entrenches the decolonial potential of the Creed. By focusing on the religious or divine side of Jesus Christ, the council concentrated on a quest for the right belief, but it missed the chance to address the quest for right practice, which would easily emerge out of the earthly ministry and life of Jesus. West contends the creed lacks systemic social analysis and systemic social theological response. Yet even without this, the full divinity of Jesus Christ lays a foundation for church-state relations. At the core of Jesus' crucifixion is his systemic social analysis of life in first century Palestine under Roman rule. The disruptive systemic social theological response he proposed, that is, justice, freedom, and equity for all people of God. That is what Jesus proposes as an alternative to the Roman system. Standing up to unjust earthly kings and profit takers can never be understood as standing against God. It is a Christian's duty to be in solidarity with fellow workers in opposition to the excesses of the profit takers and rulers. As we struggle with inequality, inequity, injustice, conflict, racism, epistemicide, spiritualicide, globally, a fresh look at Nicaea illumines the decolonial and anti-racism potential of this central Christian creed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Masiiwa. This is a thought-provoking conversation. And thank you for your profound insights. And I think that we are going to look forward to having a conversation with everyone. So for those online and those that are within the room, we have some few minutes that we can engage Masiiwa in a conversation. If you have any questions, kindly raise your hand, whether online or in here. If there are any questions or clarifications or comments or whatever it is that you would like to share with us regarding the conversation, the talk that we've just heard, the floor is open.
Okay.
Oh, looks
Just start things off, okay?
looks like we have clarity on that.
Thank you very much, Masiiwa. I haven't heard such a radical critique for some time, and I welcome it. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about early church history in terms of what happened after Constantine. But at some stage, the bishops started to wear purple. So the bishops themselves became kind of little emperors in their own dioceses. And from your analysis, that would suggest that, fairly quickly, the bishops themselves lost direction.
Thank you. Yeah, this is an interesting comment, I would say. And I think key, some years ago, I read a book by one Jörg Rieger on Christ and Empire. It does provide an interesting way of looking at the history and the complicit kind of relationship that has existed between empire and Christianity. And you are right that in many generations, the mainstream Christianity has often compromised with empire. And yet, in every generation, the spirit of Christ, this flickering light of resistance and really an attempt to stop the total annihilation of Christianity and the Christian faith, that light has always continued to flicker across generations. So you are right. At some point, having gone through moments of persecution, many bishops might have found it strategic to no longer fight empire, but rather to embrace empire. And there are also ways in which our scriptures make it possible to compromise and feel like we are doing the right thing. So this is interesting. I'm not really so much of a Christian historian. As you heard, I am much more an Old Testament person, but who likes to enter into other people's gardens and make some mischief here and there. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you, Masiiwa. And thank you, John, for that question. Actually, you made me think that the bishops actually started wearing purple. They became almost like empires themselves. Anyway, there's a question in the chat, but Linda, would you like to ask that, or do you want me to read it? You can unmute and just ask it.
Okay, thank you, Mutale. My question is, can we say that the Nicene Creed's emphasis on the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church calls for a more inclusive and anti-racist church?
Thank you.
Can we say that?
Interesting. Actually, I come from a completely different perspective. For me, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church is one of the most colonizing aspects of the Nicene Creed. So, which in a way, because it tries to create a uniformity that is not called for, I think it is possible for us all to be Christians within our different contexts, in which our faith is obviously colored by our different environmental contexts. But this idea that we need a single, uniform presentation of Christianity, for me, is actually one of the colonizing elements, which in a way might have served empire as well. Because then if we are driving towards one holy Catholic Church, why should we not accompany that by driving towards a one holy empire, Roman Empire, for example? So in a way, it's an idea that I have not fully developed, but I'm actually currently working on a paper for the conference that conference paper I presented in November, which I must submit now for publication. And that idea is one of the ideas that I pursue when I'm looking at the colonizing elements of the Nicene Creed. And that element for me is rather quite dangerous. And in the hands of European Christianity, you can imagine what it has done to Christianity in Asia, attempts to having Christianity in Africa or in the Caribbean, in Latin America, where indigenous people, for example, want to be Christians. But then in the hands of European missionaries and European mission agencies and European churches, what happened is that effectively Africans had to become Europeans in order to become members of this one holy Catholic church.
There we go. So
I do have my reservations, but it's an idea that's not fully developed. And as it is an idea coming from a non-expert in this area, it might take longer to be fully developed. But yeah, but
we'll wait for it, Prof.
This is one aspect of the Nicene Creed in which I get scared of its potential.
Oh, thank you. I don't know if there's any.
I can.
Yes,
I can
follow. Please, you can go ahead, John.
I'm sorry to just anyway. This is just a further thought. You talked about European missionaries and European churches, particularly in Africa, effectively requiring their members to become Europeans more or less. I don't think you used the word more or less. That's my word. And that you know, the sense of the unity of Christianity well, of course, the church wasn't united. The European church was not united. Are you saying that there is another unity there, which took the place of the Catholic, the Holy Catholic Church, and that is a unity of race, and in the colonial period of the 19th century, European culture, fundamentally. That is a kind of unity across all the denominations in Africa that came from outside, except for the Copts and the Ethiopians. What I have to say to that is yes, but in the midst of that, because the Spirit of God was present, then we have the beginning of the African independent churches, and we have African messianic movements, which, although maybe not fully Christian, were seeking in their own way to follow Christ. So there's always hope. And I think the hope comes from the margins. I'm sorry, this is really a bit of rambling thought, but you've stimulated me to think about it.
Yes, thank you. I think this is really positive and in a way not simply rambling about. What you present, I think, are facts about Christianity in Africa. And you are right, I think that in a way, African independent expressions of Christianity tried in a way to find ways of being Christian without being converted or integrated into some kind of European identities. And this is something that unfortunately is not decided because of the epistemological privileging of Western knowledge and Western systems. Are you aware that even as we speak, the ecumenical movement is not as open to these manifestations and expressions of Christianity because they do not meet the standard of European manifestations and expressions of Christianity? So as we speak, I think if you would check in the database of the WCC, there are very few African independent churches that have met the standard of being ecumenical members. So they continue to live outside of the boundaries that were created in this quest for, I would say, the quest for uniformity more than unity. I think at some point we went for uniformity instead of unity, particularly because unity within the Christian sense would not then delegitimize contextual expressions of being Christian.
Good.
Without undermining being in a unity of some sort. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add to that. It's not just in the ecumenical movement, but it's also been in the evangelical movement.
Yes.
That rejection of, historically anyway, it may be changing now, but certainly in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, even into the 2000s, the evangelical movement was highly suspicious of African independency. Even though most of the independent churches had as high an understanding of Scripture, though they read it in a different way, as North Atlantic evangelicals.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry I don't want to monopolize the discussion.
Thank you. I see Sarah has a hand up.
Just before Sarah, there's two questions in the chat. And I wonder whether, well, Chinyere is asking that she did not get the concept of remembering women on this presentation on the Council of Nicaea. And then Julius Gathogo, would you like to ask your question or would you like me to just read it? I can go ahead and read it.
Just read it. Thank you very much.
Awesome. So Julius Gatogo says, thanks, Comrade Masiiwa, for retracing our lives from that lens in such a detailed way. But again, are we tied to such creedal detectorship of the ancient times? Do we have other ways of looking at the creedal trajectories outside of this? And then continues, I'm also fearful that looking at the creedal trajectories from this ancient world may put the African context into the danger of getting immersed in Cornell Dutoit's concept of poverty of the Western religious experience. So are we tied to such creedal dictatorship of the ancient times? And do we have other ways of looking at the creedal trajectories outside of this? And then after this response, Sarah, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Just a quick one to Brother Gatogo. I hear you. And part of a successful decolonial experience would mean an acknowledgement of the continuing divine interventions throughout generations. I think this is part of the challenge of establishing orthodoxy or closing of the canon and so on. In that, in a way, it's supposed to protect the integrity of the faith, but in reality, it begins to constrain the capabilities of the divine. And this is a challenge that particularly is expressed through African independent churches, and I think independent churches elsewhere that continue to believe in the continuing interventions of God in their communities. Can we completely throw away the past? I don't think that is wise. I have never seen any community that completely disengages from its past and remain stable, solid, and even strong in its forward movement. I think the best forward steps are those that are built on a strong behind or initial state. So we need, in a way, to be plugged into the heritage that has been passed on to us. But I do not think that we are meant to be stuck to this ancient heritage without recognizing the continuing agency of the divine across our generations. I think part of the challenge particularly has been the historicizing of the faith. Christianity as a historical faith in a way and in a context in which history is supposed to be the things of the past. In a way that also I look at the study of the Bible in modern European times, where the Bible was reduced into some ancient document. But coming from Zimbabwe and going to Germany to do a PhD, this became a point of contestation and conversation that eventually led to the Intercultural Applied Biblical Studies idea. Because the Bible for my people is not some ancient relic meant for the archives. This is a living document from which people continue to derive inspiration for today and for tomorrow. So I think, brother, we need to find a way of reconciling the heritage that we have been bequeathed and the reality of our own experiences and of our times. And I think there is a lot of work to be done in that regard. How do we begin to find that convergence of the past, the present, and how do we allow these to help us reimagine a future of this faith and of our own lives?
Thank you, Masiiwa. Sarah, please go ahead and.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, it is very interesting topic and discussion. And thank you for provoking that. Actually, some of my questions or reflections have already been somehow discussed and addressed. But again, one of the struggle I have here is we try to read the creed within our modern lifestyle or in the 21st lifestyle, and forgetting about the context that in which this creed aimed and developed. I mean, I think the creed, as you mentioned, was very much supporting uniformity, theological uniformity, yet national diversity. From when it comes to the sociology, yes, diversity is important there, and they wanted to keep it as an important issue. And that is why the issue of persecution was discussed there. Yet at the same time, those national diversity did not go into the document, but theological uniformity and then the developing of boundaries. And for example, the idea of exclusivism. I mean, you cannot, in an interesting way, the exclusivism within Christianity, you cannot see it in any other religions. And even, for example, especially if you look at, we compare it to Islam, their idea of exclusivism is really not as rigid as we have it in Christianity and as we see it in actually the creed. And exclusivism, especially in relation to I believe, in the believing exclusivism, I think it is, I found it very interesting. And of course, it is because there are lots of different ideas, theological ideas going around. And I says, okay, do you know what? The powerful come together and make that. Loved the creed, I do. But again, how much can we push, or how can, I mean, we can read it or we can justify it based on our 21st century, but you cannot really get rid of the exclusivism in it and supporting this uniformity rather than unity. It doesn't support unity. It supports uniformity. I think that is one of my question is how can we make sure, because it is about, especially in our 21st century, we're just talking about the contextualization of theology and if each nation, and then here we have the creed talking about extreme boundaries in relation to I believe. And can we talk about separate the believing and the theology when it comes to the creed? That's my question.
Thank you. That's much more complicated for a small boy like myself. But here is the thing, and I totally agree with you. Like I said, when I spoke at a conference in November last year, I did focus particularly on the colonizing elements of the creed. And those are the key elements for me that make the creed a dangerous instrument, particularly at a time when we think we need to be more inclusive and more welcoming of people in the various diversities that might exist. So these are areas where I would cede space and voice to the experts to really engage intricately, because I'm, besides not being a missiologist, I'm also not a theologian. I'm a biblical scholar. So there is a level at which I would not be adequately equipped to address very pointed, systematic theological questions. But I agree with you that in my earlier presentation, I've also raised the concerns on what I see as colonizing elements. And in fact, in my presentation, I did hint at the fact that these two forces were all trying to outdo each other. So there are colonizing aspects that naturally Constantine would have been happy with, because they would save the kingdom, they would save the empire. But at the same time, some of the bishops, I believe, could see the real risk of Christianity being hijacked by empire, and therefore tried to insert within this document elements that could inspire generations and generations to come to resist and to disrupt empire's moves to totally annihilate Christianity or totally make Christianity an extension of the empire. So I completely agree with you, and thank you for these observations. But it's not a question where I would say I have a definitive response, but I share the same concern.
Thank you, Sarah,
Thank
for that
you.
question and for your response, Masiiwa. We have Soyoung Kim has a question as well. Could you unmute yourself and ask? Soyoung.
Thank you so much for your presentation and very interesting topic. But I wonder is when we are thinking of this, when we read this creed, they are saying that Jesus is fully divine. That one is actually when I was reading, I don't think they kind of wrote. They were thinking of about human equality. Actually, you added, but I don't think when they wrote, I don't think they're thinking about this kind of perspective. So is the idea of equality something you've added later on, or is there any other scholars who are kind of read like you? Thank you.
Thank you. The way I read this actually is based on one statement in the creed itself, which says that for our sins, if you recall, so first thing is that through him all things were made. So in a way, the basis of our equality as creatures that are made through Christ is laid there, but also for our sake, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, he suffered death and was buried. So again, for our sake, in a way that does not make any distinction between the superior class of rulers or the inferior class of the workers, Jesus' death is for all human beings in a way. So that's where I take and develop the ideas of equality within the context of reading the creed. But these, like I said, these are not really perfected ideas. These are reflections that are ongoing, and therefore sometimes they might change, they might strengthen, or so yes, but they are ongoing reflections really. But these were the basis upon which the ideas of the equality of all beings could be built upon. First, that all creation is through Jesus Christ, and this does not give not humanity or not the rulers among human beings, but rather all creation is all a product of the divinity or the divine work of Jesus Christ. And secondly, that then his crucifixion again is not meant for one class of people over others. Rather, his crucifixion is also for everybody, irrespective of their class or ethnic background or whatever distinction we might choose to apply to each other.
Oh, thank you so much. Are there any last minute questions and comments from anybody? Going once? Going twice? John, nothing?
What can I say? I can't keep them on finishing this discussion.
All right, no problem. So anyway, thank you so much, Masiiwa. This has been a rich conversation, and I think for myself, it has left so much food for thought, and I'm sure that everybody else may have also things they are going to think about regarding this. Thank you very much for being willing to share all this with us and being able to avail yourself in such a manner. Just an announcement to make. We were supposed to have another MBL lecture on the 18th of March, and Peter Cruchley was supposed to be the one taking that up, but Peter is not feeling too well health-wise, so he's unable to make the lecture. So on the 18th of March, we don't have one, but on the 25th of March, we have a lecture, sorry, let me just see, by our dear sister, yes, our dear sister Atola Lomkuma, who is from Nagaland, and she's a faculty member in the religious department at the United Theological College in England. So on the 25th of March, we'll have Atola Lomkuma speaking to us, and everyone is welcome to join in again. But thank you so much for this opportunity, Masiiwa. Have a lovely day, everyone.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful day spent with all of you. I am very grateful for this opportunity. Thank you.